Up to 3 million people in the United States have pacemakers, with around 200,000 implanted each year. Pacemakers usually are battery-powered devices that are implanted in the chest to help the heart beat at a normal rate. They work by stimulating the heart with electrical impulses to restore a normal rhythm. What if I told you there are now new possibilities using innovative technology that are changing the possibilities for people with abnormal heart rhythms?
I just can't stress enough how cool that is, right? That you can take two tiny little devices that are so small, and they can talk to each other between heartbeats and tell each other what they just did. The technology and the innovation and the novelty of that research and development is just mind-boggling.
That's Dr. Michael Broman, a cardiac electrophysiologist, and I'm Shelli Dankoff, your host for OSF HealthCare Accelerated. We appreciate you tuning in and remind you to be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. It was 1981 when the girl group The Go-Go's had a hit with We Got the Beat. While they were singing about an entirely different thing, medical technology at the time was evolving. Back then, pacemakers were primarily single-chamber devices, with the significant development of dual-chamber pacemakers starting to emerge, featuring longer-lasting lithium batteries with programmable features, allowing doctors to adjust settings based on what the patient needed. Flash forward 43 years to the world's first dual-chamber leadless pacemaker, with innovative tech to wirelessly communicate and make sure the heart stays on beat. It's being used by OSF HealthCare at our hospital in Urbana, Illinois, OSF Heart of Mary Medical Center, by cardiac electrophysiologist Dr. Michael Broman, who joins me today along with Brock Doehring, a sales representative with Abbott, the developer of the device. First of all, thank you both for being with us to talk about this exciting technology. But before we talk about the device and the advances, let's talk a little bit about your background. So, Dr. Broman, a cardiac electrophysiologist, what exactly does that mean?
It's a cardiologist who really focuses on heart rhythm disorders. Too fast, too slow, too irregular. We make it regular. We get the heart rate up, slow it down when it needs to happen, and that's what we focus on.
Okay. And Brock, how did you get involved in all of this?
Well, I've been in this industry for about 10 years now at this point. Spent about 2 years in Springfield, then moved over here to Champaign 7-8 years ago. My background's biology, chemistry, with some physics in there, so.
All very scientific, yes. So let's do a little history lesson on pacemakers. How do they work? What the evolution, I talked a little bit about what they used to be like 40-some years ago. So, and I know you have some drawings to show us what they look like and what they're like now. So walk me through that, Dr. Broman. Give me the history lesson on pacemakers.
Right. The first pacemakers were actually plugged into wall outlets. So patients would have to be tethered to the wall originally. This was back in the 1960s and 70s. And eventually the batteries became powerful enough to support a patient, and the device could be implanted under the skin. Original pacemakers were dummy pacemakers. All they could do was just pace the heart at regular intervals, and they kept a person alive. And then over time, pacemakers became smarter. They could sense what the heart was doing and only pace when needed. And that was a big advancement, because just because a patient has a pacemaker doesn't mean that they need every heartbeat to be paced. So the introduction of inhibiting pacing, right, and sensing by the pacemaker itself, that was a big advancement. Pacemaker batteries used to be enormous, right, and they've gotten smaller and smaller over the years, and these implantable devices. And then eventually pacemakers became more complicated, and you could put different leads or wires from the pacemaker battery into the different chambers of the heart. Like you said, dual chamber pacing, that was a big advancement as well, allowing for the heart's natural electricity to be maintained with the device. And the improvements in leads, the wires in the heart, the lead architecture, the battery life, the ability to program the device, the materials, the insulation of the leads has just exponentially gotten better over the last 15 to 20 years, and in the last 13 years that I've been practicing. And so it's really almost like with this newer device that we're here to talk about today, it's almost like we're starting to get to the holy grail of what we really want to get out of pacemakers, because pacemakers are great, but a person might feel limitations of a pacemaker because with the traditional pacemaker, you've got a battery in your upper chest for most patients. And that's a constant reminder that your heart's not doing what it's supposed to. So if you could have a pacemaker that was completely inside the heart, right, without any device, anything visible, any scar in the chest, well, that's really important for a lot of patients. And it helps them sort of forget about their disease for a little while and just focus on being human. And that's why I think this most recent technology is really cool and can be very helpful and very beneficial for many patients. So the natural history of pacemakers over the years, smaller and smaller and smaller, less and less invasive, battery life better and better and better, and fewer complications. And we're really getting to the point now with pacemakers that we've gotten really good with the help of industry, especially groups like Abbott, to get these things as tiny as possible and the battery life as long as possible, so patients can really just focus on their lives and less about having to think about having a pacemaker.
Yeah, from your end of things, Brock, has it been kind of impressive to watch how they've gotten smaller and smaller and smaller? And I know you have an example there, so you can show me what we're talking about. You can hold it up and show me exactly the size of it. It's tiny. I mean, not tiny, but it's very small.
Yeah, it's always been this big trade-off of trying to maximize your longevity, with the size of the device as well as making it smaller and smaller and smaller. And just to show, these are the two leadless pacemakers that we're, talking about here today. One for the atrium and one for the ventricle.
Yes.
Might be tough to see. The ventricular one's a little bit bigger than the atrial one, but the ventricular cavity is also bigger than your right atrial cavity.
Yeah, so Dr. Broman has a drawing of the heart. So show me, the thing at the top is what a pacemaker used to be like, correct?
We still implant this is called a transvenous pacemaker, right? We still implant these because there are certain patients who that device would be better for still. And we can talk more about that later. However, yes, so this is a traditional battery that would go under the skin in usually the left upper chest, a 1-inch incision, and then a pocket under the fatty layer where that battery sits. And then in that pocket, we would access the subclavian vein and put 2 leads, which are insulated wires, into that subclavian vein and use that vein like a subway to get to the heart. For most patients with dual chamber pacing, they would have 1 lead placed in the right atrium here, and then 1 lead placed in the right ventricle right here. And that is enough for most patients, I would say, who have slow heartbeats to maintain a normal heartbeat and to maintain the electrical synchrony between the top and the bottom of the heart, which is very important because you want your atria to activate and contract just before the ventricles activate and contract. So you want boom, 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 boom. And you can see now the difference between the leadless pacemakers, which are represented by these very high-tech ovals that I've drawn here, right? And just having these devices inside the cavities of the heart instead of having a battery in the upper chest with leads that go into the heart. So you can see the difference there.
Yeah, that's okay. So, and you do not even have to cut somebody open to put the leadless in, right? This gets put up through a catheter.
That's right. That these devices are implanted through the leg vein, right? Through the usually the right common femoral vein. The delivery catheter goes up, delivers the 2 devices, and then we pull that out and then hold pressure on that vein. And the patient stays in the hospital overnight to make sure there's no bleeding down there.
That is just amazing to me to think, okay, and I'll put the question to you, Dr. Broman, over your years of, medicine, when somebody said, okay, we're going to do this way, what was your thought process when you first heard this, other than being excited? I'm sure it's very excited from what you know it can do for your patients, but it's still in your mind. You have to be like, wait, we're going to do what?
Yeah, there's a lot. That's a great question. So what are the things that originally that people were nervous about for putting in these leadless devices. I think, first of all, the idea of having a battery inside the heart, you worry about it dislodging, right? If it were to move, because it's fixed there by some mechanism. There's different mechanisms that have been used over the years, and you want to make sure that the device doesn't move.
Right.
Yeah, and so with the newer Abbott Aveir device, which is the one we're talking about, AVEIR is the device that we're talking about, which is the only device that can do dual chamber leadless pacing. The fixation mechanism is actually a small screw that you deliver the screw into the heart muscle, and it's a very powerful screw for being as small as it is, right? And you can see it there.
Look
and
at
it's
that.
very, very good at holding the device in place. That was one of the things I was personally most worried about, is that it would embolize. And I have not had one, knock on wood, not one embolization or dislodgement of the device from where it's supposed to be. Because that could be obviously a dangerous situation if the device were to move.
Sure.
I think second of all, I was concerned about battery life, because these are such small devices. Are they going to have a long enough battery life? And then, to give the patient enough years with that device that it would be worth it. And that problem has pretty much been solved by the most current iteration of the device. These devices have very long battery lives. And then I think third of all, the question is, how do we talk to the device, right? Because normally with older devices, we would just put an interrogation monitor on top of the battery, and we would talk to the device that way just through the skin. So are we going to be able to communicate with these devices? Right, and there are many other things about the implantation process. We have to put a very large catheter into that vein, not very large IV, to deliver these devices. And what's the risk there to patients? And it turns out that is probably the easiest part of this procedure, I would say, is getting that IV in there, because the newer ways that we have of putting in these IVs is very effective and very safe, and is really not as big of a problem as I thought it was going to be. So. And there are many other, technical issues that really have been effectively addressed by this most recent technology, which is why I'm such a big proponent of it, because we've been waiting for this type of technology as an electrophysiology community for decades just to get to this point right now where we can actually do this and we can do it safely. So yes, it was very nerve-wracking at first, starting to do these, but with the better technology, it's becoming more of a comfort zone for most of us that do these. It's a lot less technically challenging than I thought it would be.
So how do you talk to the two sides of it? Because again, you put it in there and you got to get it going and everything. How does a physician talk to the device to get it doing what it needs to do?
Well, luckily I have excellent representatives that are present with me during implantation and during follow-up. And Brock is amazing at talking to these devices, and he can probably elaborate on how that's done.
So with this technology that we use called eye-to-eye, which is a proprietary technology, they don't give us too many specifics on it, but it communicates. We really communicate it with it almost through the blood pool and through EKG patches. So as he mentioned, with a regular pacemaker, we would put a wand over the device to talk to it. Well, with this one, we actually hook EKG leads up on the patient, and we talk to the devices through EKG patches. This eye-to-eye, instead of using like Bluetooth or radio frequency technology, which would allow us to communicate through the wand, as we talked about, uses the EKG patches. And as soon as the device gets into the blood pool, that's where it can register an impedance or a resistance, so to speak. And once it can register that, the device becomes active, and then we can talk with the device. So
That's
as he
amazing.
mentioned, with the large catheter in the groin, so kind of implant procedure, we run the delivery catheter with the device up into like the right atrium IVC junction, and you uncover the device. It's got this nitinol cover on it on the delivery catheter. And once you pull the nitinol cover back, then you can communicate with the device and program it appropriately. then obviously once it gets fixated, we can talk with it further. But
Okay, so two follow-up questions. How long does the whole procedure take from the time you start feeding the IV to get it up through the groin to get both of those leads implanted? What kind of a time frame are we talking?
It's a good question. If everything goes normally, Brock, what do you say? An hour for both batteries? Yeah.
60, 70 minutes.
Okay.
And that's from getting access to taking everything out.
Okay, and then if a patient, is this a one and done thing? I put those EKGs on and we set it, or is this one of those if we notice a patient down the road, 6-7 months is having some issue, can we go in and tweak it, or is this you set it when you deploy it the first time, or can we go back and make tweaks to it?
We can program these as many times as we want in a non-invasive way. Like Brock said, putting electrodes on the patient and talking to it. They just have to come into clinic or into the hospital to do that. So some patients might be concerned that these devices could be hacked, and there's really no chance of that with this device for multiple reasons. One is that you have to have physical contact with the patient to put the electrodes on. And then second of all, the programming is proprietary. So you need the Abbott software to make any changes to the pacemaker.
And you say these last a very long time. How long is a long time?
Well, the current estimations, and Brock can elaborate on this, the current estimations are better, more years than a traditional transvenous pacemaker, which I was not expecting when we started doing these. So currently it's somewhere around 15 years, Brock, correct me if I'm wrong, for the batteries.
So the ventricular one, as I showed earlier, is a little bit bigger. So the battery's larger in the ventricle. And most of your battery drain or your current drain happens in the communication with the devices. So with every beat, the right atrial is communicating with the RV, and the RV is also communicating with the RA. So they're communicating back and forth. And that's where the majority of your current drain comes in. But programmed in a dual chamber fashion with good thresholds, good impedance, we're seeing about 7 years on the A and 12 to 15 on the V. But that also depends on how much you're using each one. There comes a lot of factors in that. Now, if you can also use them not together. You can use, just the atrial or just the ventricle. And if that's the case, you're seeing 10 to 12 years out of the A and 15 plus out of the V, depending on how good your numbers are and how much you're using it.
Right. So we're learning more and more how to program these to save battery life and how to implant them so that we can use less battery in the communication process.
So tell me how we're using this at OSF HealthCare and how it's being put into place.
We've been doing these, the ventricular one, which is just the ventricular alone. And that would be good for patients who have atrial fibrillation and don't need atrial pacing. So if a person just needs the ventricular one, Brock, I think we've been doing those for about 2 years now, something around there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2.5, somewhere in that area.
And then for the dual chamber, we've been doing those, about 3 to 6 months now, I think. I can't remember exactly how many months. Yeah.
So
yeah.
July for the dual.
So right. And this particular device is, in my experience, is an easier implantation with less guesswork, and that's why I choose this one. There are other brands of leadless pacemakers out there, but this is the only one that can do the dual chamber and pacing. And I just can't stress enough how cool that is, right? That you can take two tiny little devices that are so small, and they can talk to each other between heartbeats and tell each other what they just did, right? And what they're about to do. And then the other one will tell the other one, hey, I just did this. Okay, now it's your turn to do this. But the technology and the innovation and the novelty of that research and development is just mind-boggling. That these devices can do that in a wireless fashion with high fidelity, right? With very few dropouts. And there are backups set into these devices should they lose communication with each other, which could theoretically happen. So if the devices do lose communication with each other, they have a backup pacing rate, right? And that automatically kicks in. So if they lose fidelity for whatever reason, there's lots of reasons why that might happen. Person might be near a high frequency energy source, like an electromagnet, something like that. The devices will revert back to their safety pacing mode. And Brock might have a little bit more information on that. But patients don't have to worry so much about whether, if they're exposed to some external radio frequency energy, will the device stop working? And the company has really put in fail safes to prevent that eventuality.
Tell me more about that, Brock. Because again, people need to be reassured about that. I get that. In this day and age, like you alluded to earlier, the hacking, the everything that's going on, everybody has a concern about that. I mean, you can't do anything without somebody seeming to know your birth date and your social security number, let alone this kind of thing. So Brock, tell me about those safeguards that are in place.
Sure. So, just for instance, say there is some type of large frequency thing where the device, in a way feels like it's corrupted. It can go into what's called a safety mode, and it turns itself into just a single chamber ventricular pacemaker. So if somebody's going to need pacing, for life support, you want to support the ventricle. So it turns itself into just a ventricular only, and then that patient would have to come. Basically, it's the device's way of protecting itself. That patient would have to come in, we'd have to hook them up, call our engineers, and basically reboot it in a way. So that's that's a safety mode in there. And then talking about the communication between A and V and V and A, what we found really is the distance between the two is really what makes them communicate. And you want about two device links distance from, this back cap to this back cap, because that's where the communication happens at. So we found, and even during the implant procedure, we kind of map it out and see, are these going to be good spots to put this so they communicate effectively? So knock on wood, we've had quite a good success doing that so far.
So let's talk about the patients. You said that everybody's not a candidate to use this. So what patients is this designed for?
Right. This device is designed for people with slow heartbeats, period. Right. So people whose heart cannot go fast enough to support them, whether it's at rest or with exertion. So this device is not designed for patients who need a device to make their heart stronger, people who have systolic heart failure. Right, so that's a subset of patients with slow heartbeats that probably would need a transvenous device, traditional device. And we would put 3 leads in then, usually for those patients. One in the right atrium, right ventricle, and one in the left ventricle. And we currently don't have a wireless or leadless solution for pacing in the left ventricle. And eventually we will have something like that. That would be the holy grail. So if we could figure out a way to get one of these into the left ventricle safely, or at least around the left ventricle and pace the left ventricle, that would be outstanding. The problem with putting devices in the left ventricle is that the left ventricle pumps blood directly to the brain. So any device that sits there, if a little tiny blood clot were to form on there, it could cause a stroke, which could be debilitating for a patient, right? Whereas little tiny blood clots that form in the right ventricle, they go to the lungs and they get chewed up by enzymes in the lungs and they don't really cause a problem. Not that these devices form blood clots, but the point is that it has been tried. So there have been attempts at putting devices in the left ventricle, which is found to be an unsafe situation for most patients, requiring they be on blood thinners for the rest of their life, and it's not considered to be ideal for those patients. So that would be one patient population. And then another patient population would be anybody who could theoretically require a cardioversion or a defibrillation, right? Because they're at risk for sudden cardiac death from ventricular arrhythmias like ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. This is a pacemaker that we're talking about today. This is not a defibrillator, right? So this device does not have the ability to deliver a shock to rescue somebody from cardiac arrest. So And eventually we will get to the point where we have leadless devices that can do that. We have subcutaneous devices that are not in the heart that can deliver shocks, but we don't have a leadless solution for that quite yet.
So what are you hearing from your patients?
We've had some very good outcomes from patients who have these devices. The big thing I think people notice is that they feel better, but they're wondering, like, how is this possible? Because they can't tell that anything has been done, and that's what we want. We want for it to be just like any surgery. Like, you get your gallbladder taken out, you feel better, right? And with the leadless pacing, to not have that reminder, right?
Sure.
That battery reminder in your upper chest that you've had something done. I think people are very positive about it. I think they're also very happy about the fact that it happens so quickly. It's such a quick procedure for the most part, and people like that. And one thing they don't like is having to spend the night afterwards, to let the vein heal up. But there's really no way around that. We really have to make sure that vein heals up properly. It's a pretty big IV, and we want to make sure that they don't have bleeding afterwards. But that's a benefit of the older school device, right? The transvenous device. Patients can go home the same day from that procedure. So some patients that don't want to spend the night in the hospital, maybe they don't like the food or something, or I don't know, they might elect to go with a traditional device, which is totally fine if they need one, right? But if they want a device that's not going to have a battery in their upper chest, the leadless is better for them. I would say the overall reaction from our patients has been overwhelmingly positive. And we've been fortunate to have good results so far, and we want to really make sure that continues. And we select our patients appropriately, patients who have good functioning hearts, just too slow, right? So that's what this device really is for.
So before I let the two of you get out of here, Brock, what are your final words to people who they might be listening to this and thinking, okay, what are they talking about? Some of this stuff sounds like, again, you're putting something here. I can't really feel it. What's going on? How does this work? You stick an EKG on me and it does its thing. What do you say to patients who potentially could benefit from this and from where the future of technology and innovation is going with devices like this?
Well, as Dr. Broman has said, it's not for everybody, but it's for a large majority of patients that need just a pacemaker, especially if the top chamber's slow, with just the atrial device. That's where a huge subset of this comes from. And to elaborate on that a little bit, we actually have a colleague of mine, I don't know her, but she's in Chicago, who needed a pacemaker, and she's, 30, 35 years old. And she actually got these. So, and, one reason she was really liked the idea is she doesn't have the scar and the pacemaker in her chest. So when she goes, to the beach or whatever, she doesn't have that reminder. Nobody even knows. The other thing is, I was going to add that Dr. Broman was talking about with staying the one night in the hospital. Well, with the traditional system, you've got arm restrictions for a few weeks to a month, which you don't have with the leadless solution. So spend a night in the hospital to not have, movement restrictions and weight restrictions also.
I also wanted to mention one more thing, Brock. Sorry to cut you off. But the newer device, the leadless device, also has a much lower risk of certain complications that can happen with the more traditional devices, and that would be infections, right? So this is right near the skin, so this pocket can get infected, and if an infection occurs, it can spread to the bloodstream, right? In the traditional device, infections are very rare with the traditional devices, probably less than 1%, and it's something that we've been pretty much able to do away with, though they do still occur. With the leadless devices, infections are almost impossible, mainly because of what the device is coated with. And the chance of any bacterial organisms or fungal organisms catching on there is extremely low. We don't have data regarding infections on these devices to a large degree yet, but they really have not been seen. So there are some patients, especially dialysis patients, who are at higher risk for having device infections. So the leadless device is a good option for those patients to avoid infections. Sorry, Brock, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, you're good. But, this is Gen 1 of dual chamber leadless. And I know Abbott's all in on, leadless, and there will be different iterations and different styles of devices coming in the future.
So, Dr. Broman, I'll give you the final words on this one. How excited are you for what this means for the future of your field?
Very excited because it's all about being minimally invasive nowadays, right? Everything that we do in medicine, the whole wave of modern medicine, like all of the new technologies are all about doing it smaller and doing it better and doing it safer. And I really think that this technology is all about achieving those goals, and being able to help people, and being able to improve their quality of life with this type of device is very very rewarding, not only for us, but for Brock too as well. And as he gets to see these patients on follow-up, he sees them in the device clinic, he sees them and he's like, "Oh, how you doing?" And they're like, "Wow, I can actually mow my lawn again." It's amazing. A lot of men, that's how men and women, right? That's how they judge if they're feeling well, is if they can mow their lawn. And being able to help patients mow their lawn, I think that's very important. I feel like Brock and I deserve a lot of credit for a lot of nice looking lawns in central Illinois. Because that seems to be what they enjoy doing the most.
And with that, because again, being normal, sometimes just being normal is what you want most. And so if being normal is mowing your lawn, I'm glad to hear that you're helping to have nicely mowed lawns across central Illinois. Dr. Michael Broman, Brock Doehring, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. And I'm sure we'll touch base down the road on some other exciting things that come out of all of this collaboration. So appreciate you being with us. And thank you for joining us as well for this edition of OSF HealthCare Accelerated. And a reminder, you can find all of our episodes online at osfhealthcare.org/accelerated.